Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Dr. Brianna Stubbs has a PhD in Ketone Metabolism from the University of Oxford and is the research lead at HVMN, a ketone ester drink and nootropics company in San Francisco. Brianna is also a world champion rower who won 2 gold medals for Great Britain in the lightweight women's double and quadruple sculls, as well as winning the Oxford-Cambridge boat race twice. She's also the youngest person to row across the English Channel at the age of 12. Welcome, Brianna.
Hi, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction.
So what led you to studying ketone metabolism, Dr. Brianna?
I guess it was a long story, starting from when I was 12, and really into rowing. And I was always sort of super active and did the Channel row when I was 12, rowed for the British under-16 team and then at the Junior World Championships. And so I kind of, that was a little bit of a factor in when I picked my school. So I ended up going to Oxford, which is obviously great academic university, but also really good at rowing as well. And so my first year there, I was rowing on the university rowing team and rowed in the boat race. And that summer after the boat race had finished, I was wandering around campus and I saw this poster advertising for rowers to come and do a research study looking at a new energy drink. And I was like, oh, this looks pretty cool. So I ripped off the little slip at the bottom and got in touch with the study team. And so they were looking for people to come and do 30-minute rowing machine tests at a sort of a low rate. So it was sort of about power and endurance. And it was at that time I was doing these tests weekly pretty much as part of my training. And I thought it was a great opportunity to contribute to science, but also they were paying participants. So it was a good way to get paid for training that I would be doing anyway and wouldn't normally be getting paid for. So, so I started in the study. In the study, we were sort of very, very early on in the development of the ketone ester, and it was not super optimized for athletes for sure. So it was given in a very, very big volume. It was about 500 mils. I think about a protein shaker. That was what we were given. And to make the flavor better, because it's got a really strong bitter taste, they dissolved it or mixed it in with a protein, pretty much like a protein shake. So it was really thick, chocolatey, kind of creamy. And you had to drink this whole protein shaker, 500 mils or so worth of bitter tasting, goopy kind of drink, and then go and do these maximal 30-minute rowing machine tests. So I remember at the time you didn't know which one you were getting. You got ketone or a placebo that tasted equally as bad. And you did these tests. And after the study, they told me which one I'd had ketone on. And it was the time when I'd actually gone and done my season's best score. So it was the best rowing machine test that I'd done all season over that distance. And it was pretty striking. There's definitely subjective experience of using ketones. It's kind of like you feel a bit more in control, like mental focus. And we know that the brain really likes to use ketones as a fuel. So sort of this kind of cognitive enhancement that a lot of people, when they're following a ketogenic diet, they kind of report that. But also just physically feeling really strong, especially in the second half of the test where normally things would get really tough. I kind of, rather than getting to halfway and feeling like I was holding on, I got to halfway and I felt like I could really push on. I knew I was having a really good day. So certainly that got me super interested in the topic and wanting to learn more. I got back in touch with the research team because I had to do a research project as part of my medical training. And so I spent a few weeks with them learning the ropes and seeing the studies that they had running. And then I had an opportunity to row full time because sort of at the end of my second year. So this is a little bit of time later. It all didn't all just happen at once. But so I had this opportunity to row full time as part of the British national rowing team. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to carry on doing medicine at the same time as that because you have to go into hospital placements and things like that. And so in order to sort of give myself time to row, I was looking at other options, and I could work as a research assistant with the study team running these ketone experiments. And so started doing that, and that actually changed into a PhD after a short amount of time. They saw that I was, useful and interested and smart enough to be on the study team. And so ended up pausing my medical training altogether. And I was for 4 years studying for my PhD, looking at the effects of ketones in sort of a sporting setting and also at rest as well. And then also rowing full time with the British rowing team. So I was funded by UK Sport, and I trained sort of about 24 hours a week, 2 or 3 times a day, competed in the World Championships 3 times and won a silver and a gold at senior international level as well. So it was really cool because the two interests kind of like grew together, especially given that when I first tried the ketone drinks, I was an open weight rower. And then when I moved on to the senior team and won the under 23 and senior world championships, I was a lightweight rower. And so ketosis is actually, evolutionarily, it came about to help us with starvation. And so, as I was restricting what I was eating and also doing all of this training, I was likely in ketosis a lot of that time. And, I certainly was very like metabolically flexible. And when I had ketone drinks as part of the experiments and trying them out in the lab, I was like super responsive to them. So it was cool to be able to get really into the weeds of sports physiology, really understand starvation physiology and ketosis and all of the different like benefits that ketosis has, whilst also kind of living it in my athletic career as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting and so fascinating how well your athletic career and your academic career just melded together in that way. I really like that. And curious, when you first tried the ketone ester, when you were over the summer, were you already on a ketogenic diet, or had you heard about ketogenic diets at that time?
Gosh, I think in 2009, the ketogenic diet was a lot less popular than it is now. And remember as well, I was in England in the UK, and I think that it's still a little bit behind where we are in the USA in terms of popularity. I feel like it's maybe like 2 or 3 years behind. So I had heard of the ketogenic diet in my medical training, or I'd heard of ketone metabolism in my medical training, but I wasn't, I used to be able to like buy like packs of chips and bars of chocolate, and I'd eat those while I was studying. I wasn't like super unhealthy, I was athletic, but I was training a lot. And, I was a student, and I would sort of eat and drink like a, student who lives away from home the first time. So I certainly didn't have the discipline or really like the inclination to be on a ketogenic diet the very first time that I tried it. Definitely my diet got much more regimented and much more thought out and controlled when I was a lightweight and when I was on the senior international rowing team. But even then, all of our dietary advice coming from our nutritionists was sort of I wouldn't have said it was high carb, because we, as a lightweight especially, couldn't afford to have a lot of calories as carbs. I mean, it was, to be honest, reflecting on it, was kind of just like low everything. And I think, that reflected in the way that I ended up with what's called RED, so relative energy deficiency. So I was sort of overtrained and under-recovered quite often in that period of time where I was a lightweight. And I don't think it's very good for women to be sort of like 10 to 12% body fat for extended periods of time. But, you can do it for a bit of time. Maybe a ketogenic diet would have been useful to help me manage my body composition. But I would say, I guess, because my diet was probably calorically in deficit, I was likely in ketosis a fair bit of the time. But I never really counted carbs. I watched my overall macros and calories. But at that time, also, the other big part of that decision was that I didn't have much control over my own training program. So we were in like a centralized training center, and all of the athletes came together and followed very similar training programs across the different squads. So your coach would tell you what the training was for the day, and you would go out and do it. Especially if you're in a crew boat, you can't play around with that too much. And so I think if I'd wanted to do a successful period of keto adaptation, I'd have wanted to have a few months where I could set my own training and control the intensity a bit more, but I never had that gap. So I think it was just one too many kind of stresses to put in the equation when I was juggling studying and dieting by itself, and also like the performance side of it as well. I mean, I was interested, and the more I learned about it, the more I was interested. But it just never made sense at the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I personally didn't come across the diet until after. Listeners may know I also rode for about 8 years, including at the university level, nowhere near the levels that you competed at. But I was also a lightweight, and looking back at some of the struggles I had to maintain and cut weight, I think it could have potentially been a lot easier on a ketogenic diet, though, to your point. Experimenting with diets and having a non-well formulated ketogenic diet while competing, 3+ hours a day, it could have been really tough and led to some very poor outcomes.
I think it's just like you need a bit of time to work out what works for you, and I didn't have that time. But I think also kind of broadly reflecting, I think lightweights could well be of the rowing subset better poised to benefit from the ketogenic diet because of the body comp demands. Right. But rowing, international rowing is 2,000 meters. So it's very heavily, power and strength and anaerobic biased. It's not completely anaerobic like a sprint, but it's a very weird mix of energy systems. And even though with rowing you train a lot at sort of very low intensities, a lot of the training is sort of endurance based rather than anaerobic. I think it would have take careful management to sort of make sure that you kept that top end, which is something that, at the moment, the research is sort of like conflicted as to whether you lose that top end power when you're on a ketogenic diet.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And can you talk a little bit about how you sort of applied your learnings in your work throughout the rest of your athletic career while you were rowing at the world level, and also just more generally how you've worked with athletes through your ketone research?
Sure. So I guess one thing to say is that when I was competing myself, the ketone ester was being produced in really small batches, actually at the University of Oxford, sort of by hand, it was being produced a couple of liters at a time, and it was very, very expensive. So actually I didn't have the ability to use the ketone ester all that often in training myself. I did do some training in competition with it, but it certainly wasn't like a regular feature. But now looking back, and knowing what we know about it now, if I could have been using ketone esters during that time, I'd have been using it in periods where I was cutting weight and the training volume was high. So typically in the rowing calendar, for GB rowing in sort of early in the year, January, February, you'd start to have to come down off your winter weight, which was higher, but also it would still be like an endurance phase of training. So like very high volume and, interspersed with intensity. And that was quite a common time that I would get sick. And so I would strategically use ketone esters now. If I could have done, I would be using ketone esters around that time to support my recovery and support my performance in those sort of more demanding training sessions where I'm also restricting energy availability. So I think that that's how I would have used ketone esters at the time. But now we work with athletes who are on a ketogenic diet and strategically use ketones, sometimes also with carbohydrates around long ultra endurance events and some shorter events as well. One of our athletes is Jeff Browning, and he recently did the double, which means that he won 2 100-mile ultra marathons up at altitude in a really short space of time. I think they're separated by about 2 weeks. So phenomenal athlete there. And he combines, I think he spends like 1 week recovering and then sort of gets his body moving again. But to win both of them as well, given that people coming into the second one are fresh, it was pretty impressive. And he's a phenomenal athlete. So we've been working with him and his carb sponsor, who is GU, ironically. So he has a GU shot in one hand and ketone ester in the other hand when he starts off his races, which is kind of fun. But I mean, the energy demand's pretty high, and he performs really well on that. So it's interesting figuring out what works for individual athletes. And then we also recently worked with an athlete called Victoria Busi, who broke the UCI 1-hour velodrome world record using ketones. And she so again, that's at like a shorter distance. But we think they're the effects of ketones on focus and also the effects to lower lactic acid in the blood and spare glycogen, because in that hour-long attempt, she doesn't take on any extra fuel. So, and she's working at very high rate. So if you can provide the body with another fuel source from ketone drinks, then you're really opening up the possibility that there's, an extension in performance because the body's just got more energy available. So that's been two of the most exciting kind of case studies in terms of individuals that we've worked with. But broadly working with a lot of the Pro Tour cycling teams, a lot of them used it in some of the big races last summer, and a couple of NFL teams. It's just been interesting to see the early adopters who are interested in the benefits of ketones for performance and for recovery and how they can implement that. But another big area of interest we've had is the US military. So we're kind of engaged in active research now to see how we can support warfighters in extreme environments such as hypoxia or cold water, and if giving ketone drinks can be a way to allow them to tap into ketones as an energy source without having to not many of them are able to adhere to the diet because, your typical soldier's diet is kind of like when they have Wendy's on base and they drink a ton of sugary energy drinks. And so, trying to affect wholesale dietary change is a bit more friction than just giving them a drink, let's just say. And also what I think is really cool about ketone drinks and is not that they can, not that they're intended to replace the diet, but what they allow us to do is separate out the effects of BHB and ketones themselves from the effects of carbohydrate restriction. So typically, if you're in ketosis and have elevated levels of ketones, that's because you're in a ketogenic state. And this is something that I always like to talk about because people get really confused and upset when I say that exogenous ketone drinks lead to a state of ketosis. But really, in the biology, normally what happens is you become ketogenic. So you trigger ketone production in the body, and then those ketones are released, and then you're in a state of ketosis, which people often refer to as above 0.5 millimoles of ketones in the blood. But really it just means you then have ketones in the blood and you can be burning those ketones for energy. So there's almost 3 steps. You generate the ketones are in your blood, and then you burn the ketones. But with ketone drinks, you skip out that generating step. And that means that you don't have to have the carb restriction or any of those things, which is important, especially for some of the health benefits of ketosis. For example, diabetes and metabolic syndrome, you certainly want to be keeping insulin low and carbohydrate intake low. But there's a lot of effects of being in ketosis that might just be because you have ketones in the blood. So, for example, beta-hydroxybutyrate, the ketone body that's the main ingredient of the ketone ester that we work on here at HVMN, it's powerfully anti-inflammatory. It works through part of our innate immune system that's called the NLRP3 inflammasome, and BHB inhibits that being activated. And so some animal models have shown that can even help in conditions where inflammation is kind of going in overdrive, like gout. But then BHB ketones can also scavenge oxidative reactive oxygen species, so they can help with oxidative stress. Ketones and BHB again, it can also act on part of our sort of gene machinery called histone deacetylases. So BHBs inhibits these things, and so it can change the pattern of gene expression, and that's associated with, for example, longevity and enhanced fat burning. So there's all these kind of effects of just having ketones in the blood, but we don't know yet exactly how much of those effects are due, when you're on the ketogenic diet anyway, how much of that's due to carbohydrate restriction and how much of these effects are due to BHB. So to go back to my kind of original point, having BHB in a drink is a really nice way to isolate ketosis from ketone production and carbohydrate restriction. And so I think it's the military anyway are very interested in sort of teasing apart the differences between those two things and really understanding how they can exploit ketosis and maybe also in the future the ketogenic diet. But as I said, I think it's more difficult to affect broad dietary changes in a kind of cohort like that.
Yeah, that's interesting and fascinating to see the broad applications you're using in athletics and the military as well across different types of sports. Because one thing I've heard talked about is ketogenic diets are proven to be great for endurance, the better access to your fat stores and that kind of long burn energy. and they can be good for certain forms of strength training or bodybuilding. But a lot of people see a gap in terms of sports that have continuous short bursts of energy, but over a longer game or time frame. So I'm thinking like soccer, rugby, basketball. Have you seen sort of, I guess it's different for being in ketosis and ketone esters, but how does the performance effects vary across types of athletic sports?
I mean, I think let's rewind back first and let's talk about where we're at with ketogenic diets in different sports. So
Sure.
I think that like kind of sets the scene really nicely. So I think as you said at the very outset, there's good sort of mechanistic reasons to believe that being on a ketogenic diet would be at least as good as being on a normal diet for endurance performance. So, there's a number of athletes who are very successful on a, more traditional higher carb diet, but there is also a number of athletes that are increasingly using the ketogenic diet for Ironman triathlon and ultra marathons and things like that. I would say that in terms of like which is better, what's interesting is that both sides try and say that their diet is better when in reality all of the science kind of has just not shown a difference between the two, which I think is a big win, because the high carb people are like, you absolutely need carbs to do anything. And the keto people are like, well, tapping into your fat stores gives you limitless energy. And in reality, for endurance, it's fairly much across all of the studies that are done, which I think is great, because I think it's like you do whichever one works best for you. If you have problems taking on like a million goo shots and actually are kind of concerned for your long-term metabolic health, then you can try a ketogenic diet and it's probably going to be like pretty good for you and like massively upregulate your fat burning and things like that. But if you can, you prefer to be able to eat cake and you want to do that in the middle of your ultra marathon, then also you're going to be able to perform relatively well as well. So I think endurance, ketogenic diet, standard diet, both working pretty well. And actually the story is pretty similar across like most of the other sports that you look at. The study results, if you pull them all together in a table, like it's pretty much across the board, very few differences between keto and mixed diet, which is great because it means that you can do whichever one works for you and you probably will be fine. I think it's about people listening to their own bodies, and you see these case stories where people have a great experience, and then you see other case stories where people have awful experiences. But you mentioned a few sports in the question where you're saying soccer and rugby and all of those kind of things. And definitely there are soccer teams and rugby teams that have come out on the record as having used ketogenic diets. The New Zealand All Blacks, one of the best rugby teams in the world, were rumored to have been using a ketogenic diet for a time. And then recently I was at a meeting at Ohio State, and the performance director of Columbus Crew soccer team was talking about using a ketogenic diet with their team. So I think, you've got some more forward-thinking team sports that are using ketogenic diets and are successful. And the reason why people worry about these like intermediate kind of sports is because there is science studies that have shown that when you eat very high fat and you adapt to burning fat and ketones, that you lose the ability to burn carbs as fast. And so the enzyme activities involved in that pathway go down. And in theory that should blunt your kind of ability to perform at these really high work rates in it, if you're sprinting for a ball, for example. But, that's the science looking at the enzyme activity. And if you look at sort of a lot of the studies out there that have used sprint stuff, again, it's not really that as clear cut as people would have you believe. There's one study that's always wheeled out to show that keto impairs sprint performance. And I can't remember the exact reference off the top of my head, but what happened in this study was I think it was people on a bike, and they did a series of 1 kilometer sprints spread out through a longer time trial. And in sprint 1, both groups are the same. Sprints 2, 3, and 4, the keto group is less powerful, goes less far than the high carb group. But in the last sprint, the keto group goes the same speed. So it's clearly not that they can't produce the same amount of power. It's like maybe some pacing effect, or there's an effect there. I'm not trying to deny that, but it's not that when you're on keto you can't produce power. So I think really it comes back to the point I made a second ago, which is if you try it, it works for you and you can still produce power. You know, there are plenty of CrossFitters and people who do these kind of more explosive sports that are on either ketogenic or paleo diets, and they're still doing fine. There was actually another recent study that showed that they were on a ketogenic diet, longer term ketogenic diet, but they showed an improvement in power to weight. That was mainly because the weight improved more on the ketogenic diet versus the low carb diet, but the power was versus a normal diet, but the power was maintained. So I think the picture that people like to paint about if you do keto, you're definitely going to lose your top end. I wouldn't say that it was that clear cut. Certainly in the short term, as you adapt to the diet, you may lose power because your body's sort of becoming keto adapted and getting used to it. But over time and with the correct training, I would be surprised if that didn't improve. So I think where we're at really now with the science literature is that there's no very clear consensus. And where we're at with the anecdotal evidence is that for some people it works very well and for other people it doesn't. So, that's the state of affairs there. Then if we talk about ketone esters, it's more unknown. So I guess with the ketogenic diet, there have been studies done, all showing no effect. With the ketone ester, we're really at a stage now where, there's still a lot of work to be done to really unpick, the effects of exogenous ketones on different types of sports. And one thing to highlight here is that game sports, for example, there's the physical component, but there's also the cognitive component as well. So there was a recent study done over at the University of Dublin, Ireland, by Dr. Brendan Egan, who's sort of an up-and-coming, very, very successful ketone researcher. And he looked at the effects of ketone ester on sprint performance and also cognitive performance. And I think he saw a small but not significant decrease in sprint performance. But, with a small study, it's unclear whether or not that effect would be meaningful. But he did see an improvement in some aspects of cognitive performance. So you wonder how all of that's going to net out over a soccer game, for example. It's not clear at this stage. So a lot of work still to be done there. We've worked with some weightlifters who use ketones before they work out, and they say because they feel more focused and more alert that they have better performances. So it's really in its early stages, but I'm interested to see the results of all of these studies as they're done in the future. But what I'm really hoping as a scientist is that that people in the general public and people in the science community are patient enough to systematically answer all these questions rather than the minute one negative study comes along, be like, oh, well, ketones are good for nothing. I think that ketone drinks and ketone esters are a really interesting tool that we can drop into a variety of different situations and unpick their effects on metabolism. There's certainly not a magic bullet that every single athlete who takes them is going to grow wings and be able to fly or go green and be able to punch through walls. I think it's, let's be realistic here. We're looking at marginal gains and we're looking at, fairly interesting shifts in physiology that the effects may vary person to person. But I think what I really don't want is to see a hype bubble where a negative study comes out and then people are like, well, these things are useless. I think actually there's a lot of different contexts that need looking at if we're going to understand how these things are relevant.
Yeah, agreed. And it must be very frustrating in an academic setting when one study with a small subject group like that sprint study shows kind of meh results and there's a conclusion, but it's kind of hard to replicate it or combat it.
There's
everyone's pointing to it.
Yeah, there's so many incidences of that. And I think, sports science is difficult to do. It's difficult to, and, even thinking back to my own experience, right? Like I was a participant in the study and I kind of cared about the study. I knew it was sort of on my calendar, but I wasn't sort of super religiously thinking about what I was eating and drinking and how much I was walking around the day before. And all of those things can affect, how much, if I change that a lot the day before each of these tests, that could really affect the outcome when you're thinking about the difference between like a good day and a great day, So we used to turn athletes away. They'd come in when I was running the studies, they'd come in and we'd ask them what training they'd done. And they'd be like, oh, well, I know you told us not to do more than an hour, but I actually went out and I did 3 hours and I did some hill repeats. But, and you're just like, no, you can't do the study if that's the case. Go away. So it's hard to run these studies and, control for all that. That's just the working out, right? But what about, oh, I skipped lunch yesterday because I was busy at work. And then before the previous study, you'd had 3 meals. All of these things are going to make a difference. Or even if you're not that diligent about the macronutrient composition of the meals, one night you had pasta the night before, and the next time around before the study, you had like a steak, that would probably affect the state that you were in before that trial. So, all these things make a difference. And so the studies are hard to run because of that. And then they have a small number of participants because of that. So you do end up with, the way I like to look at research is like a brick wall. Really, you can't make too many conclusions based on one study. You just have to be like, okay, this is a brick. I'm going to put it in the wall, and I'm going to stand back and watch this wall take shape, but not hang too much on any one brick, and try and be keep everything in perspective. So, another example of this is recently, I think it was, when was it? It was sort of sometime last year, there was a research study published that was entitled Ketone, Ester and Pairs Performance in Elite Cyclists. And what these researchers had done was take a completely different ketone ester compound. So I've been working on a compound that's called hydroxybutyrate monoester. So it has beta-hydroxybutyrate and butanediol in the compound. And these investigators had been using a compound that was called an acetoacetate diester. So rather than beta-hydroxybutyrate, it was using acetoacetate, and there were 2 parts acetoacetate and 1 part butanediol. So it was a very different molecule. It's almost like comparing coffee and tea. It's like a hot drink, but kind of not the same thing. So these researchers used this ketone ester, and they found firstly that it made sort of 16 out of their 18 participants nauseous and sick. And one participant actually had to drop out of the performance trial because he was so nauseated. And then the performance was broadly worse with the ketone ester. And there was some inference that was because of ketosis and not because of the fact that everyone was feeling sick. But a lot of people latched on to the title and the abstract of this paper and were like, oh, well, it's a ketone ester. It's the same as what you're doing. And it made them worse. And in reality, when you peel back the layers of what went on there, it was a very different situation. So it's hard as a scientist to disseminate all of this information. And it's hard as someone who's interested to, not an expert, to really understand the discussion as it evolves. So I think as scientists, we have responsibility to try and communicate clearly and have a fair discussion and, try and be impartial. And I would say, that this all applies to the stuff that I've done as well. So we had, our paper was published in Cell Metabolism in 2016. And, we did a series of 5 studies within that one big paper, looking at the effects on metabolism. But there was one study at the very end that was a performance study. And we showed a sort of 2% or so increase in performance. But, I'll hold up my hand and say that still has to be replicated before we can be, as certain as can be that there is a performance effect. But what we did show in that paper was lots of very interesting effects on metabolism, which other people have demonstrated as well. And I think that underlying, if you have something that you can consume that is that powerfully able to shift your metabolism, then that's in and of itself kind of interesting and, underlies all of the performance that you may or may not measure because of all of the confounding external factors that are more difficult to control.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. And how about there are probably a lot of folks listening who say, I'm not an athlete, but I practice a low carb, ketogenic or carnivorous diet. Should they be worried about their ketone levels as well?
Well, I think it depends on your goals. So typically, people vary on how they adapt to being on a ketogenic diet. I know some people who are on a ketogenic diet and after time, even though they do not change their diet, their ketone levels start to drop. And it's unclear whether that's because their body is producing less or whether because their tissues and their muscles, for example, are getting better and better at extracting the ketones. So you measure less in the blood. So that's unclear. But, also I know people who have been on a ketogenic diet for a long time and they tick along at 5 millimolar. So I think really once you know whether or not you're kind of successfully eating in a way that triggers the process of ketone production, And you can track over time. I think it's a useful thing to do at the start of when you're following the diet to get an idea about the level that you're reaching. But I think, if your goal is, say, weight loss, once you've established that you're successfully triggering ketone production and in a state of ketosis, then I don't think it's necessarily something that you need to monitor and obsess over a number for all of time. I think it's a useful guide when you're getting onto the diet, but it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. But for some therapeutic cases, so for example, epilepsy, we do believe that there's sort of threshold levels that you do need to reach in order to be providing sufficient sort of effect. And another condition where ketogenic diets are under investigation and could be useful is Alzheimer's disease. And there's some good case reports there, and also some recent research published by a Canadian researcher called Dr. Stephen Cunane. And he has been using a very sophisticated MRI imaging technique that allows him to see how much of different fuels that the brain is using. And you can see that when people get Alzheimer's disease or pre-Alzheimer's disease, that their brain gets less able to burn sugar, but more able, or at least the same amount of able to burn ketones. And so if you can raise ketones, then you can restore some of the energy that the brain is missing. And he's actually seen that the level of energy rescue, as it were, is directly related to the level of ketones that you get to. So in theory the more ketones that you've got, the more of the less energy starved your brain's going to be. So I think, for broadly speaking, for people who are following a ketogenic or carnivorous diet, it's useful when you're setting out to really understand how what you eat relates to ketone production, but probably not essential to obsess over in the long term, because it varies individual to individual. But for therapeutic uses, it's probably more important that you achieve a specific level to get specific clinical outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And can you talk about, you've hinted at it both in terms of Alzheimer's patients, but also earlier when we were talking about athletics, but can you talk about, in a healthy individual, some of the effects of ketones on health and cognition outside of athletic performance?
Yeah, I think ketones are a really fascinating molecule. And I think that the story of ketones going from, back in the 1900s, where ketogenic diet was, routinely used to treat epilepsy, through to their kind of like, so guilty by association sort of type relationship with diabetic ketoacidosis. And then all of a sudden, ketones are really, really bad and we don't want ketones, and going through this sort of period of 100 years or so where ketones were just thought of as metabolic waste products or actually dangerous. And now recently, more and more people are realizing that ketones are this super interesting, not only fuel, but a signaling molecule as well. So we're seeing that ketones can slow down protein breakdown. So that might be useful for people who, not only people who are, just regular Joes and want to maintain their lean muscle mass, having that protein sparing effect, but maybe for patients who have cancer, helping with a problem called cancer cachexia, which means that you get muscle wasting during cancer. And there's some very promising animal work coming out of Dr. Dom D'Agostino and Angela Poff's group there. Cancer cachexia was something else to do with protein synthesis. That's relevant for athletes as well. Ketones also signaling to help with inflammation. So as I said, directly through part of our innate immune system, the NLRP3 inflammasome, potentially being used for, as I said, gout, but also people are coming to realize that part of our immune system is involved in brain inflammation, neuroinflammation as well. So potential role for anxiety and other conditions, mood disorders as well. So very interested to see how that shakes out. Then also conditions where you get neurodegeneration, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Ketones help by not only providing another fuel for the brain, but also minimizing oxidative stress and inflammation as well. And some animal work by Dr. Richard Veach's group showed that ketones might even be able to start to remove and clear away some of the harmful proteins that build up in Alzheimer's. But, it's animal model, it's still very preliminary, but all of these things have yet to be fully explored. And then, more in terms of general health and longevity, a couple of papers came out last year from UC Davis and also UCSF, looking at, and there are 2 papers actually published simultaneously with very similar results, showing that being on a ketogenic diet or a cyclical ketogenic diet could extend health span, and lifespan as well. So not only were these were animal studies, they were more kind of fit and able to function as they aged, but they also lived longer as well. So that part of that could be due to the epigenetic effects of ketones on the histone deacetylase complex that I mentioned earlier as well. So really, we're kind of coming out of the dark ages where ketones were this sort of thing that nobody wanted to look at, and more sophisticated analytical techniques are revealing that, in fact, there may be many, many roles for ketones themselves that can impact on so many areas of health, and just performance as well, for everyone from the elite athlete all the way through to a sick patient, all the way through to your average like kind of Super Bowl mom who's like juggling the kids and a job and all of those things. So I think I'm really interested to see where this goes, and I think that ketone drinks are kind of interesting because they allow everyone to access this no matter what their diet is. So it's almost like we've created a 4th food group. You know, when you look at the label of our product, human ketone ester, there's no calories from carbs, no calories from fat, no calories from protein, and there's calories from ketones. And so I wonder whether we'll ever get to a stage where ketones will feature on the food labels of more products, and whether more people will be consuming ketones either to supplement a ketogenic diet or just to get some of the health benefits of having low levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate ketones in their blood.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And like you said, it's really exciting to see all the applications of ketones and ketosis in helping people in so many different ways. And Brianna, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, and this is a no judgment zone, but what does your diet and exercise regime look like today?
Yeah, so I still haven't managed to get myself fully onto a ketogenic diet, and I know it's sort of like on my to-do list. But when I finished rowing, I was still having like a bunch of hormonal issues, so I wanted to give my body sort of time to reset and normalize. And after a couple of years of not rowing, I'm nearly there. So perhaps it's something that I'll look at in the near future, because right now I'm training for an Ironman. So last year I did a half distance Ironman, and I went to the World Championships for that, which was held in South Africa, and that was really, really fun. And now training for a full Ironman, and I think ketogenic diet could go quite nicely in there. So at the moment I train sort of anywhere between 12 to 18 hours a week, depending on how masochistic my coach is feeling. She's a hard lady, sets me a tough training program. I do a lot of strength work right now. So I'm in the gym a couple of times a week. I swim 2 to 3 times a week, bike 2 to 3 times a week, run 2 to 3 times a week. I don't know how I fit it all in sometimes. But do a lot of like base work as well as hills and low cadence work on the bike. So really, really trying to build strength that will allow me to kind of more efficiently apply power over the whole long course triathlon. Alongside that, I do sort of periodize my carbohydrate intake. So around the longer, tougher training sessions, I make sure I'm properly fueled, but I do routinely, so maybe 2 or 3 times a week, train fasted in the morning. So if I've got just endurance where I'm not trying to go above, zone 2, like low to medium intensity, then I will not eat before that session to try and sort of trigger more adaptation to be aerobic. And there's a lot of evidence emerging now that training in a low glycogen state, even just without being on a ketogenic diet, can really boost those kind of aerobic adaptations. So I do that. And then also where my training permits and where travel and work permits, I try and get in 1 24 to 36 hour fast per week as well, because not only do I kind of like the feeling of discipline that it gives me, but I like to try and give my body a time to be in ketosis. And especially if I eat dinner the night before and then go out and do sort of this longer, low intensity training in the morning, normally by mid-afternoon, sort of 2-3 o'clock, I'm at like 1 to 1.5 millimoles of BHB, because I have a reader so I can check myself. So I know that I'm getting a good bit of time where I'm in ketosis. So I try and build that into my week. But I certainly don't eat a high carb diet. I periodize that around training, and I think it's mainly plant based. Oh no, actually, I do eat meat sort of 2 or 3 times a week, but I don't have meat every meal. Sorry, carnivore people, but I'm not vegan. I'm not vegan. So, but it's more for the expense, to be honest, and just convenience. It's easier to pack a can of tuna, for example, and a salad than it is to carry around a steak.
Yeah. Yeah, totally understand. That's fascinating. And I think the triathlon bug is one that bites a ton of rowers, former competitive rowers. It's, just another way to keep up the endurance high and, compete at a very high level. But, great to hear that you're keeping up your athletic endeavors.
Well, I was in it for so long, and it was such a big part of my routine that it's nice to sort of have that, but it's a lot less pressured than it, because it's just for me now. Whereas when I was on the national team, it was sort of like my job, and I was paid, and it felt like the end of the world. Whereas now I can pick a race, and I train really hard, and I'm very diligent about my training, but it's a little bit less like the end of the world. If I make it.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely, it sounds like a very different feel, but great to have something to replace that major part of your life.
Yeah.
And Brianna, can you talk a little bit just about your role at HVMN and sort of your goals for your research going forward?
Sure. So when I joined the company, there was no scientist on staff, and I was brought in as HVMN formed the partnership with the University of Oxford to launch the ketone ester. So really my role has been building from scratch a research and development and science organization. So we, as I said, partner actively researching with people who are involved in the military and also various clinical and sporting trials. I support them as well. At the moment, we don't have a big lab and run a lot of research in-house, but maybe in the future that's something we would look to do. But I get to speak to researchers all over the world who are interested in ketones, and also plan and run some experiments with some of our collaborators as well. So that's a big part of what I do, involved with ketones, but also just generally having oversight over all of the products at HVMN. So since I joined, we revamped all of our nootropics and relaunched them as the human performance supplements. And we did a full review of all of the evidence behind the ingredients and the dosages and all of that kind of thing. And more recently, we've just launched new MCT powder, MCT and collagen, and a fasting aid as well. And the fasting aid is kind of interesting. It's got resveratrol and green tea catechins and things that help boost autophagy and help people get more out of their intermittent fasting, help with appetite control and that sort of thing. So I've had opportunities to branch outside of just ketones, which has been really, really interesting, and see kind of how, as a company, we can thoughtfully design products that are sort of backed by science to meet the needs of the people in our community.
Yeah, that's excellent. And Brianna, just for folks who want to find out more about you, where can they find you, your research, your work? I'll link to all of this and HVMN and everything in the show notes as well. Yeah,
so I share stuff as it comes on Twitter. I'm at Brianna Stubbs, and you'll know it's me because I have a picture of rowing at the top. So you can't go far wrong. I don't think there's another Brianna Stubbs on Twitter. And that's probably the best place to find me. But I also co-host our podcast. So we have a podcast called the HVMN Enhancement Podcast. And we have loads of guests from sort of, I guess, that your listeners might be interested in, similar kind of background. We just recently had one with Dave Keto, talking about cholesterol and the ketogenic diet. So I co-host that as well. So that's a good spot to kind of keep up to date with some of the science that we're doing at Human, and also just kind of get more interesting content.
Great. Well, really appreciate you coming on today, Brianna. This has been fascinating, and I think folks will get a ton out of it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to chat.
Yep. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.